ich darf als nächsten Redner ganz
And
herzlich
I will now
begrüßen
call
den
on
Igor Khorozyan.
Mr. Igor
Der ist ehemaliger
Khorozyan.
Mitarbeiter an der
He
Georg-August-Universität
worked
und
at the
heute
Georg
Berater für
August
Forschung
University and
an
today a
Säugetieren und
consultant in
Artenschutz.
mammal research and
Und er hat
biodiversity
sich mit der Frage
conservation. And
beschäftigt,
he looked at
wie
the
wirken sich
question of
verschiedene
the effectiveness
Herdenschutzmaßnahmen
of cattle
auf die
protection
Effektivität
measures from
gegenüber dem Wolf
wolves.
aus. Er wird seinen Vortrag
He
in
will be
Englisch
speaking
halten
in
und er wird
English,
heißen
and
Effectiveness of
it is going
different
to be called
interventions between
effectiveness
cattle and
of
wolf.
different interventions between cattle and
Herr
wolf.
Khorozyan, herzlichen Dank und ich bitte Sie,
Mr. Khorozyan,
Ihren
thank you very
Bildschirm zu
much.
teilen.
So hello everyone. I'm Igor Khorozyan. Formerly I was from University of Göttingen. I'm an independent consultant. And I work in the past few years on effectiveness of different interventions against mammalian predators, large predators, including wolves. And here I want to share the results of my research on these. But before I go, just a brief introduction. I hope we will hear much more about that during this nice conference. Just about the issues of wolf expansion. Why do we talk about this issue? And in the past 20 years or so, we see a remarkable comeback of wolves in Europe and North America, caused by favorable conservation policy, increase in tolerance, increase in habitat suitability, and many other factors. In Asia, wolf is always common, so problems there are persistent, but in Europe, it's more or less a new phenomenon, which puts coexistence and local livelihoods at big stress. So here are a few maps from good research efforts all over Europe, showing that wolves continue rapidly expanding all over Europe and also recolonize the areas where it was extinct in the past 1 or 2 centuries. And this expansion causes more and more financial burdens on the national budgets because wolves kill livestock, and the governments have to compensate that to local people to ensure the coexistence and tolerance to wolves somehow. And these compensations are the highest, of course, in the areas with the highest losses to livestock, which are in the north and in the south and east of Europe. But this is not the end of the story, because the scientific analysis also shows that potentially suitable habitats in Europe cover much wider areas than current habitats. And you see on the graph below that potentially wolves can live in most areas of Europe. So this predator is expected to continue recolonization and expansion further in the coming years. Here are just a few figures coming from Germany, which is well known for its history of wolf recolonization from the year 2000, and how its expansion and development led to an increase in predation on cattle. A couple of scientific papers in the early 90s, 2000s, they didn't reveal any signs of cattle predation, possibly because of some differences in methodology, because predation on generally livestock, not only cattle, is quite a rare event. So it's very easy to miss fecal materials containing livestock and make a conclusion that wolves don't kill livestock, but actually they do. And here are the pie charts of official data coming from the DBBW. I think everybody knows about this official platform of statistical information about wolves. And it shows that from the year 2002 up to now, the share of cattle in all livestock killed by wolves increased from 2% to 7%. And this increase was persistent over years. So we can conclude that the share of cattle increased by more than 3 times in the past 20 years. So it's an alarming trend. And cattle is apparently the only livestock species in Germany which tends to increase over years, because sheep and goats, they are traditionally heavily predated, hunted by wolves in high numbers, but you see this line on top, it's more or less stable over years. And the same is also with game species like roe deer and mouflon, which don't change much. But with this red line, you can see that the shares of cattle increase over years from almost 0 to that 7%. And these percents, they may look as insignificant and low numbers, but we need also to consider that the total numbers of livestock are dramatically increasing, soaring all over Germany, and you see it on the right graph. And with these soaring numbers, 7% would make a substantial number, causing lots of problems for rural livelihoods. And the problem with cattle predation is that cattle have high market price. So as my previous colleague from Bavaria showed, cattle production and cattle numbers are decreasing over Germany. So the holdings decrease. And in this case, loss of a single cow would collapse the whole family economy in a year or more. So this is a trend, persistent trend over years, which make us think more about this, about how to find solutions on cattle production. Why do we need to talk about effectiveness? Effectiveness is the basic part of our discussions about how to protect cattle. And this estimation and discussion of effectiveness, it consists of 2 parts. First of all, we ecologists should conduct scientific research, experimental research, well-designed with best available knowledge to create evidence on what is effective and what is not. But having effective interventions on hand, it doesn't automatically mean that these interventions would be used by local people, because they have different interests, they have different traditions. And here we come to the social part, where we need to involve social scientists as much as possible, who could study which effective interventions are locally acceptable, because it can be affected by local traditions, local practices, and other factors. And also to define which of these effective interventions are really practical, because they can be effective but not practical, for example, expensive, or have other reasons. I will tell a bit later about that. And I'd like to share with you information about this online tool, which was developed recently by the scientists from Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. It's an online platform to add information about existing evidence, and it creates a kind of a hint or options for you to make decisions on which interventions to use and how. So generally, this a very simplistic form of this relationship from effectiveness to practice, it looks like this, that we first select effective interventions, then decide which of them are acceptable, yes or no, which of them are practical, and once we define the practical out of effective ones, we put them into a use. And then the use also shows whether they are effective or not, because every use is locally specific, and any intervention, for example, electric fences or any other, it can be effective on one site, but not effective in another one because it depends on some locally specific factors. So what was the purpose of my study? It was to find and describe published scientific studies on the effectiveness of cattle protection interventions from wolves. I published recently a paper in Perspectives in Ecology and Conservation, which created a detailed and comprehensive database of the effectiveness of different interventions against large predators, including wolves. And it included most, because possibly I missed also something, but it included most of existing meta-analysis and global analysis published so far. So this effort included information from 33 publications and reports, not only scientific papers, 8 online libraries, and also the databases of Web of Science and Google Scholar. And the methods included the inclusion of studies and exclusion of studies based on certain criteria. First of all, I included those studies which applied strictly defined study designs, experimental study designs, which are generally in ecology borrowed from medicine, from evidence-based medicine. And I paid most attention to most reliable study designs like randomized controlled trials, before-after control impact design, crossover design. These techniques are most reliable because they use proper control samples without interventions against which we can compare whether an intervention is effective or not. There are 2 more study designs which are very common, very widespread, but they are less reliable. They are called before-after and control impact, or without, because they don't use proper controls. They compare just what was before, for example, the intervention and after intervention, but it's not the before situation is not a control, because these changes can be caused not by an intervention, but by other factors. For example, over time, the numbers of livestock increased, or livestock husbandry practices changed, or something like that. The second criteria was that these studies had to contain quantitative information about the effectiveness, either directly or indirectly, so I could calculate this effectiveness on my own. And of course, these studies had to be conducted in the wild, because quite many papers are conducted in captivity with simulated conditions. In this case, I excluded those papers because they didn't provide a clear picture about how it would work in real scenarios. I also excluded the studies which applied lethal interventions, because the purpose was to consider non-lethal livestock cattle protection interventions. And I also excluded the papers which combined cattle with other livestock like sheep, goats, and others, so they merged them together and considered all together. In this case, it would be impossible to say how this intervention works, particularly with cattle. I estimated effectiveness in terms of the relative risk. It's a very common statistic metric of effectiveness. It's very simple to calculate. So it's a ratio of the proportions of killed animals in the treatment samples with interventions and in control samples without interventions. And most effective interventions are those which are where the relative risk is equal to 0. So it means that the number of killed animals in treatment sample is down to 0. So we reduce the damage down to 0. And in this case, we also interpret this as the damage reduced by 100%. Generally, when we strive to reduce damage. So effective interventions are those where relative risk is less than 1, so it reduces damage. Ineffective interventions have equal to 1, so there is no change. So damage remains high whether we apply this intervention or not. And counter-effective, it happens when interventions increase damage instead of decreasing. It also happens. So despite this effort, quite substantial effort in searching for the literature, I found only 9 studies which clearly explained how effective or ineffective are the interventions against cattle, in cattle protection from wolves. And let's consider them one by one. 4 studies, most of the studies, about a half, they were about the husbandry, about the use of guardian dogs, enclosures, and shepherds. And 2 of them were effective, and 2 of them were not so effective. You can see them different in colors. The first case was in Italy with the use of guardian dogs and enclosures simultaneously. It decreased losses to wolves by about 40%. And the problem with this, that it increased only by 40%, which is not enough, was that cattle were freely grazing on in fields. There were no fences. There were no any prevention measures to prevent wolf attacks. And most of all, the main prey for wolves are newborn and very young cattle, calves. And cows were allowed to give birth just on the grazing grounds. So it means that calves were available to wolf predation year-round or most of the year. And that was the reason that wolves were always around, and they caused a very high damage to local cattle. In the United States, guardian dogs were effective. They reduced losses by 100%. And the main reason was that there were the farms were small, so it was quite easy to manage cattle. And these dogs were well trained, and they were obtained from reputable breeders, which were specialized in breeding dogs for shepherds, for livestock guarding. In Russia, there was a study on the effectiveness of shepherds in the Russian Far East, in the steppes. It's a plain steppe area, so it was quite easy for shepherds to manage their cattle on horseback or by bikes. And in this case, it was also effective by, it reduced damage to nil, to 0, because shepherds were very watchful and vigilant to wolf attacks. And enclosures in Portugal were not so effective, against for the same reason as in the first case, that calves were always on the ground and cattle were freely grazing. 3 studies of invasive management, all were conducted in the United States, and all they were effective. They reduced damage. And these interventions represented special devices which accepted signals from radio collars. And these devices were installed right in the field on a grazing ground or just on calves or cattle. And once radio collared wolves approached, that device produced strong sounds and lights just to deter wolves away. Later, I will show that this method is effective, but it's not practical. Why they reduce this damage completely is that because they produced unpredictable signals, so wolves didn't have time to habituate to diverse signals, and they associated signals with some undesirable behavior of attacking livestock or undesirable areas which were cattle farms. So wolves are smart animals, so they associated these signals with those undesirable things. Two more methods were applied, one in America and one in Canada. One method is the breeding control of cattle, just to manipulate with mating of bulls and cows so that they would produce calves just in a certain period of time, not year-round, but in, for example, 3 or 4 months of spring and late winter, as it happened in America. They produced calves only from February to May, so they reduced the availability of calves to wolves. And after their births, calves were kept in villages, in farms, not allowed to move into the grazing grounds. So generally, there were only adult cattle, and wolves were reluctant to kill them. Flattery is another quite popular technique, which was tested in Canada. It also reduced losses to 0, but it was tested only for 2 months. And after 2 months, wolves continued entering the territory and killing livestock. Flattery is a fenced area, fenced with ropes, with red flags, trembling on the wind, and created a visual deterrent, trying to keep wolves away from the area. So what are the key considerations from this research? First of all, our results are still incomplete because I so far collected only 9 studies about cattle protection from wolves, so it's not enough to make firm conclusions. And only one of these 9 studies used strong study designs, which is also a kind of an invitation to scientists to apply more robust designs in these effectiveness experiments. But still, there is a possibility to specify some prerequisites, those factors which allow to effectively protect cattle from wolves. First of all, calving should be outside of grazing grounds in farms or villages and seasonally limited to certain periods of time, not year-round. The second is the use of fenced areas to limit cattle movements, because unlike sheep and goats, cattle, they move widely, and when they graze freely, it's really difficult or even impossible to control their movements with guardian dogs, with shepherds or other interventions. So their movements should be limited to certain areas, and fencing would be highly recommended for this. Use of night enclosures is also useful to keep cattle inside these enclosures during the nighttime when wolves are most active. Not every dog is effective in guarding and in deterring wolves and other predators, so they should be well trained, and it takes lots of time, effort, and money because these high-quality dogs are really expensive. Farms ideally should be small and medium to ease the process to facilitate the management and control of cattle. Shepherds should be vigilant. Like dogs, shepherds, not every shepherd is effective, so they should be also very vigilant, very watchful, very mobile to keep an eye on the livestock. Invasive interventions like radio color transmitters, they are effective but impractical, and those studies in the United States, they were old enough, and after that I didn't find any new studies on that, so apparently they stopped operating or moved to more practical interventions. First of all, these methods are expensive because they need collaring wolves and capturing, immobilizing wolves. These methods are inapplicable to wide-ranging cattle if they range freely over large areas, and most importantly, they require all local wolves to be colored, because cattle can be still killed by non-colored wolves, but we would never know who killed that cattle. And flattery is effective only within a very short period of time, and it acts as a novelty, but so it doesn't really protect livestock from wolves. So it's kind of deterrent for those wolves which didn't see flattery before. Generally, this period is 2. I didn't find in the literature that it would be effective for longer than 3 months. So here is the list of literature, including those with the interventions against wolves. And thank you very much.
Ja, Herr Khorozyan, erstmal ganz herzlichen Dank für die
Yes,
spannende
Mr. Khorozyan, first of all, thank you very much for this exciting overview of the effectiveness of livestock protection measures, and chat and questions and answers is quite lively. So I will read out the first questions in English.
Were present per herd, or how was the ration shepherd animals in the Russian study?
Excuse me, what study? Excuse me, I missed the point. Your voice.
I think it was the study in Russian.
Yes.
About the shepherds in the.
That study was in the area to the east of the Lake Baikal. It's a plain steppe area on highlands, and that study showed that those farms which didn't have shepherds, they always were affected by wolf attacks. But those where shepherds were present, they never experienced attacks. So it was a case control study comparing with and without, and that's why it was concluded that shepherds were effective.
And what was the ration between shepherd and animals?
Ratio, you mean the number of shepherds to number of I don't remember exactly how many shepherds they used, but apparently they should be not many, but usually they use no more than 2 shepherds per herd.
Gut, dann hätten wir eine Frage aus dem Publikum.
Yes, then we have a question from the audience. Mauro Bellardi asks,
stellst du deine Frage auf Englisch oder Italienisch?
will you ask in English or in Italian?
In English.
Macht's in English.
Okay. Okay. Igor, thanks for your presentation first. I have one comment and a question. The comment is that apparently in USA the people are better than us because all their studies are a full success. To be honest, it's curious. I honestly don't think that the USA protections dogs and shepherds are better than the Italian ones, for example. But maybe I'm wrong. But let's see in the future.
Possibly yes, but
question is because I didn't understand the cattle depredation rate in Germany is 7% of what? So 7% of total cattle?
Yes, killed by wolves.
Of the animals sprayed were cattle. I guess that the cattle free ranging are a small proportion of the total cattle, because 7% of total cattle seems
No.
number.
It was 7% of all.
Numbers. Thanks.
It was 7% of all livestock killed by wolves. So it was a share of cattle among all livestock killed by wolves.
Okay, dann noch eine
If this is so, then another question from the chat by Uta Kilau. She asks in English as well.
Loss of cattle to wolves should not be only be given in percentage, but in real numbers, because the amount of cattle killed by wolves is still relatively low.
Yes. I just provided the general statistics over the country.
Yeah, rise given in percentage overestimates the impact of wolves on loss of cattle. I'm involved in the wolf management in Schleswig-Holstein, Germany. All bodies of killed animals are undertaken a close investigation in our forensic laboratory. This shows first that in cattle, wolves killed calves more than adult animals. And it shows that most of the killed animals are unaffected by diseases, sometimes even zoonosis, and should have been treated by a vet, which is due to the preference of wolves for young, weak, or sick animals.
That's correct. I provided just a general picture. I didn't go into details about how cattle predation differs between different land or between different farms. Generally, predation issues are very random and sporadic over space and time. So it can be very high in particular farms and zero in other ones. So I provided just an average situation using those numbers which were available in official statistics. About killing weak individuals, that's correct. There is much evidence that wolves and generally predators, they prefer those individuals which are easier to kill, but in scientific literature, I didn't find indication that sick individuals are particularly selectively taken by wolves. So this is an issue which needs to be addressed more by science, of course. And also we need to know whether they select for males or females. Yes, it's understandable that they select for young individuals, but it's also interesting to see how, for example, sex-related differences in behavior between male calves and female calves can affect also predation. This is also important.
Dann hätten wir noch eine Frage aus dem Publikum vom Uwe.
Yes, then we have a question by Uwe Friedl.
Okay, I pose it in English. Is it possible that the rise in cattle killings is due to improved livestock protection for sheep and goats, so that wolves and wolf packs who formerly killed sheep and goats now use cattle?
Hard to say, because I didn't see official statistics about how fencing is affecting predation by wolves. This is another scientific issue, actually, because the government pays millions of euros for fencing, but I didn't see so far. Maybe there is some information about the effectiveness, but we don't know how it works in practice. We need to assess that for sure. It's quite possible, a possible reason of increasing killing of cattle is that they are freely moving. Unlike sheep and goats, they are not confined to certain areas, so they spread, and sooner or later they enter wolf habitats. So it's just a matter of encounters, mutual encounters.
Anything to be answered. Okay, so thank you, Mr. Khorozyan, and
Thank you very
I wish
much.
you the best of success for your work.